Our scripture reading this morning are selected verses from the 26th chapter of Matthew. One of the 12, the one named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he looked for an opportunity to betray Jesus. In the evening of the first day of unleavened bread, Jesus reclined at table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "The truth is, one of you is about to betray me." They were greatly distressed and started asking in turn, "Surely it is not I, teacher?" Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the dish with me is the one who will hand me over. The chosen one will go as the scriptures foretold, but woe to the one by whom the chosen one is betrayed. It would be better that that one never had to have been born at all." Then Judas, who was betraying Jesus, said, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said it yourself." During the meal, Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. "Take this and eat," Jesus said. "This is my body." Then he took a cup, gave thanks, and gave it to them. "Drink from it, all of you," he said. "This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, which will be poured out on behalf of many for the forgiveness of sins. The truth is, I will not drink this fruit of the vine again until the day when I drink it anew with you in my heavenly parents' kingdom." Later, when Jesus went with the disciples to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was in distress, but the disciples could not stay awake to pray with him. Later in the evening, he said to them, "Get up, let us be on our way. Look, my betrayer is here." While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, accompanied by a great crowd with swords and clubs. They had been sent by the chief priests and elders of the people. Judas had arranged to give them a signal. "Whomever I embrace is the one," he had said. "Arrest him." He immediately went over to Jesus and said, "Shalom, Rabbi," and embraced him. Jesus said to Judas, "Friend, do what you're here to do." At that moment, the crowd surrounded them, laid hands on Jesus, and arrested him. Ancient words from our tradition for our present day understanding.
Good morning.
You roadies.
Yeah. Can we go to the first slide? Okay. So behind me is a picture of a Bureau of Land Management helicopter herding wild mustangs into a makeshift corral. They call this a gather. And they do this because they feel that the mustangs are depleting the land's resources. There's not enough left for the cattle, and by that meaning the cattle ranchers on the land. And there's a Mojave poet and author named Natalie Diaz, and she describes this gather in a visceral way. The helicopters are space cowboy-like and press down upon the land, down upon the herd, driving the horses deep into washes, up over hills, and across the openness in the direction of the makeshift captivity corrals. The gather of these wild beings also requires a great betrayer, a Judas horse, trained by the BLM and released undercover into the herd to lead them to the trap, the Pied Piper of horses parading them toward a dim end. So this phrase, Judas horse, this horse that's released into the herd to betray all of horsekind, that which is most beautiful and wild and free. So Judas in our culture has become an archetype, right? synonymous with ultimate betrayal of the worst kind. And because of that, Judas has been a topic of literature, art, theater for centuries. Can we go to the next slide? These are a couple of examples from the 14th and 17th centuries. And this displays that kiss of Judas that gives away who Jesus is when the authorities come to arrest him. And one more. And in our sanctuary over here, right under the light, is this by Robert Hodgel, which is a more recent work, line of cut of Judas leaning in to Jesus to give him away. So in the story today about Judas in the Bible, there are a lot of other bits and pieces that we didn't read, even though that was quite a long reading. But to sum up what happens to Judas in the scriptures, his life ends tragically. One account, he commits suicide. The other account, he sort of explodes into a field and dies. Originally, he was called as a disciple and called a friend, but henceforth, after this episode, he is known as the great betrayer. He's also known as the one destined to be lost in Scripture, one who should never have been born, one who did what he did to fulfill Scripture. And we know he is this infamous character, in Dante's Inferno. He occupies the ninth and inner circle of hell, along with Cassius and Brutus, sort of eternally being devoured by Satan. And this story of Judas is troublesome, right? It's bothered me for a long time, might have bothered some of you for a long time, but something you've thought about. Because it feels like in the story, Judas is a pawn. This idea that he did what he did to fulfill Scripture. He was just playing a part in a larger story which he didn't have control over. And the idea that he was destined to be lost, that he was sort of eternally lost, as the way it's been interpreted, is incongruous with the rest of Scripture, with this God who has unending, limitless love. I also think it seems, at least on the surface, unnecessary to the plot. So in that example of the Bureau of Land Management going after wild mustangs and using the Judas horse, they didn't really need the horse. They were going to come for these wild mustangs anyway. It helped their cause. But you've got this helicopter symbolizing that sort of American notion that land is privately owned and can be used however those who are profiting from it want to, regardless of life. That machine, that's coming for these wild mustangs without the Judas horse. Just like in the story of Jesus, it's leading to Jerusalem. It's leading to this conflict with the Roman authorities, with those who are in power in the religious authorities. It didn't really need Judas to happen. It might have hastened it. It might have added a little drama to the conflict, but why this story? Why Judas? In Children's Chapel, we often use godly play. Some of you may have heard of that. It's a technique to help kids wander through the stories in the Bible, and we ask questions afterwards, like, what was your favorite part of that story? Where could you see yourself in this story? And then one that I really think is interesting, what could be left out of the story and still be the same? What would be lost if we left that piece out? And so I've been asking myself that question. Could Judas be left out of the story? Would anything be lost from that? And as I've thought about this question, I've thought that there's something really profound and powerful about the act of betrayal being really close to the heart of the story of Jesus, really near to the climax of the conflict in this story. Whether it comes by Judas or any other character in the plot, betrayal, right there at the core of this. So I think there are few experiences in life that are more painful than betrayal. And we've all experienced that to lesser or greater degrees. Betrayal by a trusted colleague, betrayal by a friend who shares something that was never meant to be shared, betrayal by your beloved, betrayal by a family member who didn't see you as you were. We've all experienced that. And betrayal affects us deeply. I mean, it can make us sick, literally, break our hearts, but it also affects our ability to connect with others, to trust others, to be vulnerable, to show who we are. It can lead us away from relationships and community, and we know how life-giving and how necessary community is, how relationships bring meaning to our days. And so I think at the core of this story of Jesus, you have this story of betrayal, that's included in this powerful story in our lives of this Jesus taking on the most painful of human experiences. And what's interesting to me is that it happens in the context and the story of this Last Supper, this last meal that he's having with his friends and disciples and the community gathered around him. In this Last Supper, which becomes a ritual that we repeat over and over and over again in the Christian church. Because communion itself represents coming together as community. It represents healing and brokenness and the hope for the world. And the traditional words start with, on the night in which Jesus was betrayed. So those words have been repeated for centuries, millions of times, on the night in which Jesus was betrayed. That word betrayed is included in this core ritual that we do. And he says, we say, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, he offered it to the community saying, this is my life given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So I think contained within those words and this ritual that we repeat is a really profound promise of healing. That there is life and love and community after betrayal. That deeply painful experience which breaks our hearts. When betrayal breaks our hearts open, communion makes them whole. When betrayal separates us from each other, communion helps reconnect us. It's this powerful symbol of what is possible with love. So maybe, somehow, some way, there is a gift hidden in that story being included in our story. Of course, I'm still left wondering about the betrayer, right? We have a story about someone who, by all accounts, seems unredeemable and unforgivable. And this is in Scripture, right? In this core text for this tradition. If that is the case, if there is someone who is unredeemable or unforgivable, is there an exception clause to grace? Are there, in fact, limits to the limitless love of God which we proclaim? Could we find ourselves, could anyone find themselves eternally outside the circle of love? And that just is incongruous with what we believe, right? Next slide, please. So these are pages from a comic book called Judas. I put it in the library if anyone wants to look at it. And these two pages really get to the heart of this conflict that I feel. And I'll read these to you, or summarize them. So there's Judas being given the 30 shekels of silver, and then saying to Jesus, did you know it would be me from the beginning? Did you know all of it? And here he is in this slide in hell, feeling discarded. Next slide, please. And he's wrestling with this. Was this always my story? Could I have been forgiven? Why am I here? Did I never have a choice? If I never had a choice, why am I here? And then he meets this character in the story, Satan, who says, I don't think you've been told, but I'm sorry, Judas. And goes on to say, we're both trapped in the story. What story? The only story. And I felt so refreshed, really, when I first read this, like, oh, yeah, other people wrestle with this too. Judas is trapped in a story that's much larger than himself, with seemingly no way out. Does that have to be the end of the story? That's where the story ends in Scripture, but does that have to be the end of the story, the final conclusion? Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a little spoiler for this comic book, but this author and this graphic illustrator reframe this story. So this is one of the last pictures in the book, and this is Judas helping Jesus out of hell. And he said, this is my story, this was always my story. And just like these artists, there are a lot of artists and writers and religious types who have struggled with the ending of Judas's story over the years and used their imagination to reframe it. I'm thinking of the Argentine poet Jorge Luis Borges, who wrote 3 versions of Judas. And there was even a recent off-Broadway play, The Last Days of Judas Iscariot. If you ever hear that it's coming, I want to go see it. And the setting of that story is really a trial that's set in purgatory, seeking clemency for Judas. The current Pope, Pope Francis, has himself wrestled with Judas and on multiple occasions brought up Judas in context of speaking about mercy. Next slide, please. If my sources are correct, he takes comfort in this sculpture that comes from an 11th century cathedral called the Cathedral of Mary Magdalene, and has a picture of this behind his desk. It shows, in quite a graphic way, the death of Judas, but then Jesus carrying Judas out. Next slide, please. Okay. So I've thought, because I've thought about Judas a lot, I've thought about why is it that I'm so disturbed by Judas? Why can't I just let this story go? And why have so many other people wrestled with Judas? Why is there so much written and created about Judas? Why is he this archetype that we wrestle with? And I wonder if this quest to find a different ending for Judas' story is really about my story or our story. Wondering if there are, in fact, limits to the love of God. Do we all have a little Judas in us? Have we betrayed a confidence? Have we broken promises? Have we transgressed our own deeply held values or turned away or averted the cause of love? Could we too find ourselves outside the circle of love, never able to get back? I think so many of us can't accept the ending in the scripture to the story of Judas because it's impossible. There are no limits to the limitless love of God. There are no exceptions to grace. And the fact that so many people wrestle with this story speaks to that truth that lives within us. We are all within the circle of love. Betrayed, betrayer, everyone. As long as there is love, there is always the possibility of a different ending to the story. We are not trapped in someone else's story about us. We are not trapped in our own story about ourselves. We are not pawns. We are not a Judas horse merely used for other people's ends. We have the power to tell a new story about our lives. We have the power to tell a different ending to the story of Judas. Because with love, we can imagine it differently. We know the core is this limitless, radical, universal love of God. So we can imagine all of us gathered around a common table, the entire human family, every last person, saying on the night in which Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, saying, "This is my life. This is the limitless love of God given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." I leave you now to your own reflections.